episode 283 of Late Night Linux, recorded on the 20th of May 2024. I'm Joe, and with me are Phelan.
Evening.
Graham.
Hello.
And Will.
Hello.
A couple of episodes ago, we talked about what we think is going to happen over the next 10 years. But it got me thinking about how much has changed over the last 10 years and beyond that we've all been using Linux. And things have really improved quite a lot. And last time, it was a little bit of a downer, I would say. So let's try and be positive about this. Let's talk about how much better things are now than when we first started using Linux. I mean, some of you have been using it so long. Right? Did you even have X back then?
Yes. Shut up. Fucking millennial.
But I think all three of you have been using it longer than Ubuntu's been around, right?
I'd say 96 for me.
Wow.
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, probably the same. Maybe a little bit later, maybe 97. I tried it on my Amiga and I couldn't get X running on my Amiga. So the next step was to try it on a PC, Red Hat 5, which I think is 5.1. I think this seems to be a common denominator.
So I'm like a child to you then.
You've only just realised.
In so many ways, Joe.
Because my first experience was like Ubuntu 7.10 maybe.
Fucking hell. Not even the first LTS.
No.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, you people think that Arch is difficult to install. You should have tried it in the 90s.
400 floppy disks.
Yeah.
One wrong selection and my monitor's gone up in sparks.
Is that actually true?
Yes, it is fucking true. And I shat myself trying to read the fucking label with a mirror at the back of my monitor. I could barely shift because it was 300 kilos. And then, was it telling lies? Who knew?
So you're telling me that you could actually destroy a monitor with Linux back then?
Yes, because you had to put what I think was called xmodline in the xorg.conf, which was the capabilities of your monitor because it couldn't read it from EDID. So you had to put its vertical and horizontal refresh rates and all those kind of things, the timing. And on some monitors, if you got that wrong, would break.
Because, of course, we're talking CRT back then.
Yeah.
Not even flat CRTs. Shitty fucking round ones.
And it was the same for everything. Networking, input. Get any of these things wrong and you basically locked yourself out of your system and you couldn't SSH into it to fix it.
You might be able to telnet in, though.
Yeah,
I was going to say, I'm not even sure SSH existed then, did it?
Or Gopher or Finger or something.
And I've heard stories about dependency hell, right? So did you use it before package managers like apt?
Well, I didn't use Debian until probably into the 2000s because I had no internet connection initially for about 3-4 years. So it was a cover disks or box sets. That was the only way to get software. So, I mean, doing updates is just crazy, but installing packages was a nightmare. RPMs, I think, with Mandrake and SUSE, I can remember those kind of going badly wrong and not really knowing how to get dependencies to work with them. It was a mess.
Yeah, I remember that from trying Red Hat. You try and install something with, was it Yum in those days? It might not even have been Yum. And it would say it needed something else. And yeah, you just had to go and try and find it on one of these mini disks. And I think Slackware came on the front of some magazine. And I think that was probably the first thing I used. But then very, very shortly afterwards, Stuart Langridge put me onto Debian. And then that was it. You know, Debs were an absolute revelation.
Well, at least for me, there was no internet. I mean, I had dial-up, which I could use for a bit of web browsing and email, but I couldn't upgrade a distribution. It meant waiting for a significant release of Mandrake that I could get on a cover disk to be able to upgrade my system. So it was really exciting, you know, to kind of install an update of Mandrake and get all the latest versions of everything, of the desktops and the browser and the latest things that were crammed on there. And it was like I used to really look forward to it.
And of course, there was no booting from USB then. You had to boot from optical disks, which just took ages.
There was no USB.
Well, yeah, if you go back far enough. What about live sessions?
Yeah, you see, that's what I was going to say. Because the first time I booted a live session, it was actually a BIOS disk. Because I hadn't a clue what the hell live disk meant anyway. Because it was just totally foreign. And I remember booting that thing up and I don't know, BIOS had the volume set to 5,000% or whatever it was. I'm surprised I didn't blow my speakers and my sound card up, to be quite honest. But then soon after that, I think there was a Red Hat live disk on PC Plus. I want to think it was PC Plus. Yeah, maybe. But it's so bizarre. Like, because you were like, what do you mean a live CD? I don't even know what that means, let alone have a CD drive. And now what is this new thing?
Well, even back in 2007, for me, I'd only experienced installing Windows. And that was like not even really a proper GUI installer. It was the XP installer with the blue screen and all that. It was like almost like a Ncurses installer. So when I first booted Ubuntu 7.10, it was just this revelation. What? I've got a whole operating system that's just running off a CD. What? How is that even possible? Whereas now we just take that for granted. If there's something wrong with my system, I'll just boot from a USB stick in like 30 seconds, run boot repair or whatever, and just fix it, or just reinstall it in 5-10 minutes, copy all my stuff. Within 20 minutes, I'm just completely back to how I was. Whereas that just wasn't an option then. If you broke shit, you had to fix it.
There is some magic that has been lost where I no longer need to compile my own kernel. In those earlier days where you go through make menu mod, make something...
Menu config,
yeah. And you'd go through this seemingly never-ending list of options describing pieces of hardware you'd never heard of. Or do I need that? I don't know.
Turtle Beach?
Yeah.
What?
And if you lost, like if you missed one of them out that was critical to something else, nothing would work. And you learned so much about the inner workings of the kernel and the dependency chains and things like that. That, I think, is what hooked me and made me interested and kept me interested. And now we don't have to do that anymore. I am equal parts grateful, and I can't help but feel something's missing.
I am 100% parts grateful that I don't have to deal with that bullshit, quite frankly.
Look, when I moved out of Ireland in 2002, and I said, right, that's it. I had dual booted previously, and I went, right, I've got a laptop. It's only got a 20... See, I don't know if I had a 20 gig or a 20 meg. I must have had 20 gigs on it. Yeah, surely 20 gigs. So I said, I've only got space for Linux, and saw SUSE. Went to try and watch movies from the local store, video store, because obviously you rented DVDs. There were these disc objects that you played movies on. Mm-hmm. And turned out I didn't have DMA access to my DVD drive, so I had to recompile my kernel for that. It then turned out that my graphics card was this weird ATI chipset that didn't work properly for acceleration. So I had to install the Gatos driver. If anybody knows what that is, I salute you. And yeah, that was the only way I could actually play and watch movies when I moved out of Ireland. It's ridiculous.
Whereas now, even if you've got a high-end NVIDIA card or whatever, you can at least do 2D stuff like that with the Nouveau drivers.
You can do it with a Pi, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
Do you remember the WinModem mess, especially on laptops?
Oh.
When, basically the entire function of a modem device was in firmware. It didn't actually physically do anything unless you loaded the firmware. And there was only Windows firmware. So there was a whole ecosystem around emulating that firmware in Linux software using Wine. It was hell until you could change the card. And another big milestone for me, I think, was sub-pixel hinting, anti-aliased fonts. Before then, we just had raw bitmap fonts, and I think you had to compile the kernel, or at least the graphics driver as part of the kernel, to be able to enable it. But I remember I spent a long time with my icons and fonts, but that really seemed like I don't know when that happened. It feels like 2004 or something, but it really felt like a high tide mark.
It's funny, I'm looking at the italics part of our doc now and realizing how aliased that is. So it's changed loads if you're an XFCE user.
Yeah, GNOME's still got some work to do on that. NDIS wrapper, was that the thing for Win modems?
That I know from Wi-Fi drivers.
Yeah, you're in a whole different league of development kit there. But come on,
PCMCIA network.
Oh,
drivers.
Jesus Christ!
Yeah,
I had a PCMCIA card that worked with the Air NG, or was it Air Cracker? It was back on, was it WEP? Was what it was called before WPA? Yeah, I remember it actually supported doing the sniffing of that stuff. Oh, it was great.
But hardware support now is so much better, isn't it? I mean, let's put aside ARM, which is a bit of a nightmare, but you can go and buy pretty much any, let's say secondhand, year or so old x86 laptop, and it's pretty much going to work, isn't it?
Pretty much. And the people we've got to thank for that are Intel and people like the hardware enablement team at Canonical, and I'm sure Red Hat have a similar team, who have worked for 20-odd years, 30-odd years to make this work. Like Intel, when they really embraced Linux and started putting drivers out for open source, well, for their hardware into open source projects, suddenly you could go and pick up a laptop from Curry's or somewhere and be relatively sure that it would work. And that was quite an enormous change.
It's funny you mentioned wine, though. That has seemingly been around longer than I thought.
I remember it being around forever, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't looked when it started. Have you looked?
1993.
Wow. Over 30 years. That's amazing. Because gaming was just not an option back then, whereas now with the Steam Deck and the work Valve's done with Proton and everything.
Oh, the BZ flag, come on.
I remember playing Unreal in the Linux format offices in like 2004.
Compiling your own network stack was games.
I mean, I also remember you couldn't share sound devices. It took quite a long time before you got like a multiplexing sound driver. I mean, for audio, so that only one application could use the sound card. I know that there's been many, many different things that have come and gone since then to try and solve that problem. But in the beginning, it was just one ALSA app or OSS, and that was it.
Before the glorious days of Pulse Audio, eh?
Yeah.
And now Pipewire.
Yeah.
Changed again. Okay, this episode is sponsored by Entroware. Go to entroware.com. Entroware sells computers with Ubuntu and Ubuntu Mate pre-installed. They've got a range of desktops, laptops, and servers, and most parts are configurable, so you can pick the CPU, RAM, and storage that's right for you. If you can't find exactly what you want, then do contact them, and they'll work with you on a bespoke solution that's perfect for your needs. They ship to the UK, Republic of Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. And if you do buy one of their machines, there's a little drop down at checkout, and you can select Late Night Linux so they'll know that we sent you. So go to entroware.com for all your Linux computing needs. On to a bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to latenightlinux.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you even get some episodes early. And if you want to get in contact, you can email show@latenightlinux.com. What about in the last 10 or so years then? Because even 10 years ago, things were pretty good, but they do feel like they've improved.
Steam. I think Steam is the last 10 years. Well, it's probably not even 10 years, to be honest, but I think that has made a massive difference because I can go on Steam, and yes, I might not be getting the AAA titles, but I just buy a game and try it, and it usually works. That's an amazing thing to be able to do.
Phelim's going to hate me for this, but I think containerization has really changed things. Docker's probably a little bit over 10 years old, but that becoming the kind of chroot. I mean, chroot's always been around, but making that the default.
Chroot was always shit, though. Let's be realistic.
Yeah, but I mean, it's something I rely on for so many things now, whatever the container might be. I can't imagine doing things without it, one. Or a VM.
Oh, VMs, yeah.
Well, I was going to say virtualization. That's not 10 years, but probably when you lot were first getting into Linux, that was nowhere near where we are now.
No, the idea of a hypervisor, I can remember the first, there was VMware, but I remember Xen, the XEN, becoming a really big story in Linux. I don't know when, that was probably 2006 or 7, no, 9, I don't know.
That's all IBM mainframe stuff, really. And I remember reading articles in probably Linux format, to be honest, would have been about how that was now the thing that was coming out. And that was probably early 2000s.
Yeah, Xen was 2003, actually, which is quite shocking.
Was it? Okay. Jesus. Oh, wow. That's disturbing.
Wow. So virtualization has come a massively long way since you started then. And the availability of proprietary software, over the last 10 years, that has become much better or worse, depending on your viewpoint there. Thanks, I think, in a large part to Canonical. I need Zoom sometimes because that's how people want to talk to me. And Snap install Zoom just works every time.
Yeah, and I guess Electron is really the underlying platform here, which in turn is thanks to Google. So as much as it pains me to say so, we owe an enormous debt to Electron and all of the massively heavy applications it has enabled. But we have got things like Zoom, and without it, we wouldn't.
Can we just take a step back and realize that Skype had all of this before Microsoft bought them, and it worked really well. And there was a client for Windows, Mac, Linux, and it all worked. And it was great. And then they bought them and all went down the shitter. And then we had to have all these Electron apps.
Yeah, actually, I remember having Skype in the early days, yeah.
ICQ was better.
I mean, this isn't related to Linux directly, but there are some areas where open source has really come to dominate. There's obviously the web, but things like Blender, I know it was open source before then, but now it's become so hugely successful. And the same may happen for Godot, where we're seeing these have become kind of leaders in their field. Maybe not quite as good as their proprietary alternatives, but they're open source. And I never thought that would happen. I'd also like to say that I think security is massively improved. Or we take security as seriously as we should. And the distributions do, and I think we do much more than we used to. And it's almost the standard model for a secure setup is Linux.
Is that because it was more security through obscurity back then?
I think so. Maybe Phelim's better positioned to answer that, but I think so, definitely.
Well, this week alone, I had an auditor ask me why I hadn't installed a patch that came out 2 hours ago. And I went, what? I was like, yeah. And I just went, fuck my job. Fuck my job. I hate it. I hate it so much.
Had it even been packaged yet?
Do you know what it turned out to be? A false positive from the company that provided the scan.
Oh.
What are the odds, eh?
Massive, actually. Every time.
Another aspect, I suppose, is that there's a lot more money now sloshing around in Linux and open source. For better or worse, I don't know. I think ultimately for the better on the balance of things. But you didn't have huge open source companies back then, did you?
No, that's a good point. I think that these days you can carve a career out in open source and you can work pretty much exclusively within the open source ecosystem. And there are hundreds of companies that you could work for. 10 years ago, there were probably a handful of significant open source companies. And I'm sure there were plenty of very small companies who were using open source, but now it's almost like a prerequisite to be some kind of SaaS, is that there will be an enormous open source stack on which they depend.
But then, as Phelim would argue, you've got the likes of AWS, which is not quite a good thing.
Well, yes, that's the not a positive of the last 10 years. In fact, a massive negative is that there seem to be a lot more companies who are interested in taking free software, in free as in beer sense, and turning it into something that they can charge for. I don't think that was as prevalent 10 years ago.
No, it'd be one of those things where going forward, you'd just wish that people could go work together a bit more, not have to double every month or whatever, but, you know, insert our rant against capitalism here, like usual.
But if you think about the trillions of dollars that have come into open source over the last 20 years, I mean, it's got to be billions, if not trillions. That has got to be good. That's why we've got a situation where you can just boot Linux and not worry about your fucking monitor exploding. Among all the other things that we've talked about, like the virtualization and containerization and all the innovations that we've seen. It all ultimately comes down to the fact that people have found ways to make business models work with open source. I mean, look at how big Red Hat is, for example. I mean, since the IBM acquisition, it's somewhat gone to shit, but they are still producing a fair bit of open source software. You know, like paying Husey, for example, to work on the FWOPD stuff. I mean, I know that's ironically not open source software, a lot of that firmware, but at least there is an open source way to install the firmware.
I wish my motherboard manufacturer would allow or work with FWOPD. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons that I love shitty old ThinkPads, because they're mostly all supported.
I guess they have that going for them. That one thing.
Yeah, among many other things.
One thing. Yeah, one thing.
I think the most significant change over the last 10 years is Microsoft coming onto the scene and loving Linux and investing in WSL and getting firmly behind it in Azure. Who would have guessed 10 years ago that that was the situation today?
Wow, you're right. It's almost like they brainwashed us into forgetting about it.
I mean, you say 10 years ago, but can you imagine in the 90s thinking that they were going to get involved?
I think right up to about 5 years ago, could you even have imagined?
Wow.
I mean, that is amazing. Not only just for us, but for all the people using Windows who are now doing things with WSL and the way that it's no longer two different camps and open source. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. Maybe that is the biggest thing that's happened.
You're going to get him started, Graham, don't you?
No. I'm accepting that you're wrong, but I'm not going to point it out.
You're not going to point out that it's a good thing that WSL exists.
I can't do it.
It is good. It's great that if you're forced by your company to use Windows, then you've got the option of at least semi-proper Linux.
Sigwin was fine. What was wrong with that?
And the GNU tools as well that you can install on Windows.
Oh, so MinGW or something. Oh, dear. Yeah, painful.
God, I can remember trying Sigwin actually back in the day. Michael Tiemann, who went to Red Hat.
Yeah, that sounds about right, actually, yeah.
So we've always needed to do that. We've always tried to do those things. And it's great that it's finally not like a battle, both a metaphorical battle for what computing means, but and also in real terms. It's part of the App Store.
Yeah, and you had Putty back then as well.
No, Putty's terrible. Different key format. What's that all about?
Yeah, terrible compared to the great Windows terminal, which is open source now, along with Notepad. Who would have thought that Notepad would be open source?
Oh, thank God. We definitely don't have enough text editors, that's for sure.
Visual Studio Code?
No, stop.
Maybe not the plugins.
You've taken the playfulness out of this.
Well, you've got VS Codium, which I think is open source, isn't it?
Oh, shut up.
But I think you're right that it is a better situation now where you haven't got these, apart from failing, you haven't got these like siloed camps. Open source is just like the standard thing.
I'm not sure I agree with that. You still see enough of it. It's definitely better, but I think you still see enough of the, I don't know whether it's snobbery or there's definitely something still about though. You're not going to walk into any company and, oh, it doesn't matter what OS you use, as long as you can access the apps. No, they'll have a Windows system, for sure.
But no matter which way you look at this, the whole world of Linux is so much better than when we all got into it. You look at the Linux desktop before you. Graham, you might have to imagine. Or look at one of your VMs or something. But if you look at the Linux desktop and compare it with what we had back then, everything about it is better now. And you can't say that for everything in modern life, can you?
No.
I would like to just say that I sit here using Firefox, which is 20 years old, and Audacity, which is 23 years old. And some things have stayed the same, and that's okay.
They've stayed the same, but they've also improved. Look at how much Audacity's improved with the real-time plugins and stuff now, and all the great features that have come to Firefox. I know we shit on Mozilla, but it is an amazing browser that has kept up with the likes of Google and Apple.
Yeah, totally.
Well, do let us know what you think's improved since you started using Linux, whether you've been using it for 30 years like these old farts or 6 months like some people who listen. You can email show@latenightlinux.com. But we'd better get out of here then. We'll be back next week when it'll probably be news and stuff, but we'll have to see. Until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Phelan.
I've been a very old man.
And so have I.
See you later.